So I finished my reread of The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers last week, and I only read this book for the first time in April of this year, and I enjoyed it so much that I wanted to reread it. And now that I've read it twice, I figured I should probably do a book review for it. So this is a young adult science fiction novel, but it's so much more than that. The plot follows the crew aboard the Wayfarer. The Wayfarer is a tunnelling ship, which means that it creates portals, wormholes, whatever you want to call them, from one point in space to another point in space. And it's quite a dangerous career because you have to go through the stuff in between space that can time warp, and it all gets a little bit technical and all that stuff goes over the top of my head a little bit. But this book follows the crew on that ship, and it's a very, very character-driven read. There is an overarching plot, which is that the crew have a job that they have to do that takes them across the universe to build a tunnel to a new area of space. But although there is that overarching plot, that's not really what this book is about. This book is really about the characters. It's a very, very character-driven book. And so if you're a plot-driven reader, it's not one I would necessarily recommend because I think that you will struggle to get through it. Each chapter is very episodic. It kind of has its own beginning, middle and end, and there's kind of a moral to the story for every chapter. And most chapters focus on one or two characters, and although the other characters are there, it's more of an analysis of that particular character. So we get to know the crew aboard the Wayfarer very, very well. So we have Rosemary, who's arguably our protagonist. She's at least the person that we start off with. And then we have Ashby, who is the captain aboard the Wayfarer, and his is probably the other main perspective in this story, I would say. Aside from Rosemary and Ashby, we also have Sissix, who is the ship's pilot, Jenks and Kizzy, who are the on-board engineers, Dr. Chef, who, as his name suggests, is the doctor and chef aboard the Wayfarer. We have Corbin, who is essentially in charge of fuel. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of it. Lovey and Ohan, who are the navigator. And I say who are because Ohan is a really interesting character who identifies as a bonded pair, so as two people in one body. So the correct pronouns for them are them and they and are, etc. So I really enjoy. That's just one example of the fantastic representation that is in this book. There is cultural diversity, there is species diversity, which is very reminiscent of racial diversity in the context of this book. The human race no longer has any racial characteristics. For the most part, you're looking at interspecies politics, interspecies communication, and it's just such a fascinating look at humanity, really, but through the guise of alien politics, I suppose. This story is about so much more than just the plot. These characters, I became so invested in them and their relationships with each other and the way that they act like a family. They are a family and they look out for each other, and they each have their own problems and they help each other through them, and we get to experience all of that with them throughout the episodic nature of the story. And I honestly can't recommend this book enough. Even if you're not typically a sci-fi reader, I think you could still get a lot out of this book, although there are some spacey, sciencey elements to the story. They are not overburdening at all. Really, space and the spaceship Wayfarer are just the setting for this story, and there isn't a lot of focus on world building anyway. The focus, as I said before, is entirely on the characters, their relationships with each other, their relationship with themselves, and their relationship with the universe at large, really. And so I think that this would appeal to contemporary readers especially. I think that it's very slice of life-esque, but it's also very political, and I think it's pretty ahead of its time actually. I think it was originally published in 2015, but I think that the author self-published before that. Yeah, so it was self-published in 2014 and then picked up and traditionally published in 2015, so 4 or 5 years ago, and it very much deals with topics that are quite prevalent today and that people are screaming out for in literature today, and it's all in here. I honestly think that this book is fantastic and I would urge everybody to give it a try. I also really recommend the audiobook. I do all my rereads on audiobook now where I can, and so I read it the first time physically, but then I reread it this month on audio, and I really enjoyed that experience as well. I think that the narrator did a really great job of, because there are so many characters, I think it could be difficult to differentiate between the voices of those different characters, but the narrator did a fantastic job with that, and I was very easily able to tell who was speaking at any given time, even if I wasn't told. A quick word on pacing. I found it really well paced because, like I said, each chapter very much has its own story arc, so there's a beginning, middle and end to each chapter, and for that reason it feels like the pace is quite quick. Plus some of the chapters are quite short, some of them are a bit longer, but none of them are super long. I mean, it's not a super long book in general really. It's 404 pages, so not a super long book anyway, and then the fact that it is so episodic and based in each chapter, that kept the pace moving along quite quickly for me, which is something that I find important. If a story stagnates too much, then I can very quickly lose interest, but the pacing was great and it kept me engaged enough that I actually got through it quickly both times, both when I read it physically and when I read it as an audiobook. I also think it's the kind of book that I will reread again and again and again, just because I loved the characters so much and enjoyed spending time with them so much. And the rest of the series, there are 2 more books in the series, so it's a trilogy, but they're more like companion novels than sequels because they don't follow the same characters. So they follow some characters that appear in this book, but they don't follow the crew aboard the Wayfarer. At least I don't think so. I know that the second book doesn't. I haven't really looked at the synopsis for the third book just in case there are spoilers for book 2, but my understanding is that they are companion novels rather than sequels. So I will definitely miss the characters from here, and so I'll want to reread it time and again, to revisit them and to spend more time with them. I think the fact that I reread this so soon after originally reading it just speaks volumes about how great I thought this book was, and I think that it's the kind of book that you could get something new from every single time you read it. I felt emotional on both reads, but for different reasons, and I think that that was completely based on my own mental and emotional state at the time that I was reading it. So yeah, I mean, I've probably gushed enough at this point, but I do, just as per usual, want to do a quick reading from the beginning of the book, as I do in all of my book reviews, just to give you a little taste for the writing style. So, day 128, GC Standard 306, Transit. As she woke up in the pod, she remembered 3 things. First, she was travelling through open space. Second, she was about to start a new job, one she could not screw up. Third, she had bribed a government official into giving her a new identity file. None of this information was new, but it wasn't pleasant to wake up to. She wasn't supposed to be awake yet, not for another day at least, but that was what you got for booking cheap transport. Cheap transport meant a cheap pod flying on cheap fuel and cheap drugs to knock you out. She had flickered into consciousness several times since launch, surfacing in confusion, falling back just as she'd got a grasp on things. The pod was dark, and there were no navigational screens. There was no way to tell how much time had passed between each waking, or how far she'd travelled, or if she'd even been travelling at all. The thought made her anxious and sick. Her vision cleared enough for her to focus on the window. The shutters were down, blocking out any possible light sources. She knew there were none. She was out in the open now. No bustling planets, no travel lanes, no sparkling orbiters, just emptiness, horrible emptiness, filled with nothing but herself and the occasional rock. The engine whined as it prepared for another sublayer jump. The drugs reached out, tugging her down into an uneasy sleep. As she faded, she thought again of the job, the lies, the smug look on the official's face as she'd poured credits into his account. She wondered if it had been enough. It had to be. It had to. She'd paid too much already for mistakes she'd had no part in. Her eyes closed, the drugs took her. The pod, presumably, continued on. And that's just chapter 1. That already just makes me want to reread it, and I read it last week. So I really hope that you'll consider picking this one up. I really recommend that you do. If you do, let me know, and then let me know what you thought of it. If you've already read it, let me know what you thought of it. And if you're going to add it to your TBR, let me know that too. And if you have any books that maybe sound a little bit similar to this one, then let me know that as well. I want to know all the things. But that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks. Bye.